Hello, and welcome to Forgotten Worlds for Sleep. Tonight, we'll journey back thousands of years to the cradle of civilization itself, the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. Long before the pyramids rose in Egypt or the road stretched across Rome, humanity here built its very first cities, carved the first writing into clay, and dreamed of gods who shaped the universe. Close your eyes and imagine the Euphrates flowing softly under the moonlight, the sound of distant flutes drifting from temple walls, and the glow of torches flickering against mud-brick towers. In this story, we'll wander through ancient markets, step into ziggurats that touch the heavens, and follow the rise and fall of kings whose names have echoed for over 5,000 years. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let the forgotten world of Mesopotamia carry you gently into rest. This is not just history. This is the dream of where civilization began. Long before steel towers touched the skies of modern cities, and long before the marble columns of Greece or the mighty roads of Rome, there was a land that became the stage for humanity's first great experiment in civilization. This land was Mesopotamia, a word given by the ancient Greeks that simply means between the rivers. It stretched across the fertile floodplains created by two powerful waterways, the Tigris and the Euphrates, that began in the mountains of modern-day Turkey and flowed south toward the Persian Gulf. To understand why Mesopotamia became the cradle of civilization, one must first imagine the geography. The land itself was paradoxical. Unpredictable floods, burning summers, and dry plains that seemed inhospitable at first glance. Yet beneath this harshness was a gift. Each year, the rivers carried rich silt from the northern mountains and deposited it on the southern plains. This natural cycle renewed the soil, making it one of the most fertile regions on Earth. With the right tools and knowledge, humans discovered that these wild rivers could be tamed, channeled, and persuaded to sustain life. The geography of Mesopotamia also gave it a unique position in the ancient world. It was open land, with few natural barriers, making it both a highway and a battlefield. Armies could march across its flat plains as easily as merchants could travel with caravans of goods. Ideas, technologies, and people constantly flowed in and out. Unlike Egypt, with its protective deserts and singular Nile, Mesopotamia was vulnerable, dynamic, and always changing. This openness would shape its culture, diverse, innovative, and often unstable. The people who settled here were not born city dwellers. For tens of thousands of years, their ancestors had roamed the hills and valleys as hunter-gatherers. They followed herds of gazelle, collected wild wheat and barley, and lived in small, mobile groups. But as the Ice Age ended around 10,000 BC, the climate warmed, and wild grains grew in abundance along the river valleys. For the first time, humans no longer needed to wander endlessly in search of food. The rivers provided. Slowly, camps became villages, and villages grew into the first towns. It is hard to overstate the significance of this shift. By staying in one place, people began to change their relationship with the land and with one another. They built homes of mud and reeds. They stored grain for lean seasons. They raised sheep and goats, not just for hunting, but for wool, milk, and meat. In doing so, they unlocked something extraordinary: surplus. For the first time in history, communities could produce more food than they immediately needed. This surplus would become the seed of everything we recognize as civilization: specialized work, trade, writing, and government. The rivers did not just shape the soil, they shaped the imagination. For the early inhabitants, the unpredictable floods of the Tigris and Euphrates were both a blessing and a terror. Too little rain, and crops failed. Too much flood, and entire villages could be washed away. These forces were beyond human control, yet they determined life and death. It is no wonder, then, that the first gods of Mesopotamia were gods of water, storms, fertility, and flood. Religious life and daily survival were intertwined, and the rivers became not only physical lifelines, but spiritual symbols of creation and destruction. The strategic location of Mesopotamia also connected distant worlds. To the north lay Anatolia, with its mountains rich in metals and timber. To the east stretched the Iranian plateau, a gateway to Central Asia. To the west was the Levant, leading to the Mediterranean, and to the south, the Gulf opened routes to Arabia and India. This crossroads ensured that Mesopotamia was never isolated. From the very beginning, it was a place of exchange, of goods, of ideas, and of conflicts. But the story of Mesopotamia is not simply one of geography or resources. It is also a story of resilience and human creativity. To live between two rivers meant constant adaptation. Communities had to learn irrigation, to dig canals, to build dikes and reservoirs. They had to cooperate with neighbors, but also defend themselves against them. They had to experiment with new ways of organizing society because survival demanded it. Out of this struggle came the first cities, the first writing, and the first laws. When we call Mesopotamia the cradle of civilization, we are not speaking in metaphor. Here, in this land between two unpredictable rivers, humans first learned how to live together in large numbers, to organize beyond the family unit, to plan not just for tomorrow but for generations ahead. It was messy, it was often violent, but it was also astonishingly creative. Mesopotamia teaches us a fundamental truth. Civilization is not born in comfort, but in challenge. It is forged in the tension between chaos and order, between the wildness of nature and the determination of humans to shape their destiny. The rivers provided the stage, but it was human ingenuity that wrote the script. And thus begins the story of humanity's first great chapter, the story of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. When the great sheets of ice that had blanketed much of the northern world began to retreat, humanity stood at the edge of a new era, the end of the Ice Age, around the 10th millennium BC, transformed not only landscapes, but also the destiny of our species. In the hills and valleys of Southwest Asia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved their way toward the Persian Gulf, something extraordinary began to unfold. For countless generations, people had lived as wanderers. They moved in small groups, carrying their possessions on their backs, following the migration of animals and the seasonal rhythms of plants. They knew how to chip stone into blades, how to set traps, how to track gazelle across open plains. They lived with nature, not against it, yet they were bound by its limits. Survival meant constant motion. Comfort was fleeting, and hunger always lurked near. But as the climate warmed, new possibilities emerged. The once barren hillsides of the Fertile Crescent sprouted with wild wheat and barley. Herds of wild sheep and goats multiplied in the valleys. Almond trees, figs, and pistachios grew in clusters. For the first time, the land offered enough abundance that people could linger. They began to return to the same camps year after year. Then slowly, they stopped leaving. The shift was subtle at first. A few families building sturdier huts of mud and reeds, rather than temporary shelters. Stone mortars appeared, used to grind grain. Clay figurines, perhaps symbols of fertility or protection, were left behind in the dirt floors of homes. These were the footprints of a profound transformation, the move from a nomadic life to a settled one. Settling down changed everything. Once people lived in the same place for multiple seasons, they needed to manage resources differently. Grain could be stored in pits, but storage required protection from pests, rain, and thieves. Animals could be hunted, but they could also be herded and gradually domesticated. Goats provided milk as well as meat. Sheep provided wool as well as hides. Slowly, the old rhythm of the hunt gave way to something more predictable, farming. Archaeological sites like Abu Huraira in modern Syria reveal this story in layers of soil. Beneath the floors of round houses lie bones of wild gazelle and seeds of wild plants. But as centuries pass, the bones shift, more sheep and goats, fewer gazelle. The seeds change too, wheat and barley with larger grains, more suited for harvest. These are the fingerprints of domestication, the patient, deliberate shaping of nature to serve human needs. The world's first villages were modest, but revolutionary. Imagine clusters of round huts, their walls plastered with mud, their roofs supported by wooden beams. Smoke from hearth fires drifted upward, mingling with the scent of roasted grain. Children played in the dusty courtyards, while adults tended to the fields nearby. For the first time in history, humans were tied not just to each other, but to the land itself. This new way of life carried risks. Staying in one place made communities vulnerable to floods, droughts, and raids by outsiders. Diseases spread more easily in dense populations than in small, mobile bands. But the advantages outweighed the dangers. A settled life meant more stability, more children surviving into adulthood, and the chance to accumulate knowledge across generations. It also transformed human relationships. In a nomadic band, decisions were made by consensus. Everyone carried roughly the same weight, and survival demanded equality. In a village, things became more complicated. Who owned the best fields? Who stored the most grain? Who decided when to plant and when to harvest? Inequalities began to form, and with them, the first seeds of social hierarchy. Religion, too, adapted. For mobile bands, the natural world was filled with spirits, of animals, of rivers, of forests. For settled farmers, the forces that mattered most were fertility, rain, and the cycles of the earth. Shrines emerged within villages, simple at first, stones arranged in circles, figurines buried in the ground. They reveal a belief that unseen powers controlled life and death, and that humans could influence these powers through ritual. This was the age of experimentation. People tested which plants grew best in different soils, which animals could be tamed, which tools worked most efficiently. Stone sickles were chipped sharper, baskets woven tighter, huts built sturdier. Knowledge accumulated slowly, but its effects were profound. By staying still, humanity accelerated. Yet this was not a sudden revolution. It was a gradual shift, unfolding over centuries. The last hunters and the first farmers sometimes lived side by side. Some groups continued to wander, while others built permanent homes. But as time passed, the balance tipped. Settlements grew larger. Storage pits became granaries. Huts became houses. Communities that once depended on wild herds now relied on their own fields. The land between the rivers was changing, and so were the people who lived upon it. What began as a survival strategy became the foundation of civilization. Humanity had discovered the power of place. No longer bound to the endless chase of animals across the steppe, they had found a way to root themselves in the earth, to bend nature to their will, and to imagine a future more secure than the past. The Ice Age had ended, but something far greater had begun. The experiment of settlement, born quietly in villages along the Tigris and Euphrates, would eventually transform the world. And though the people who first built those mud huts could never have imagined it, their decision to stay would set humanity on a path towards cities, empires, and written history itself. As the first farmers dug their fields and herded their animals, their modest clusters of huts slowly grew into something larger. Villages became communities, and in some places, those communities took their first steps toward what we might recognize as towns. These were not cities yet, but they were more than scattered families. They were proto-towns, experiments in living together on a scale never attempted before. Among the most famous of these early settlements was Jericho, located in the Jordan Valley. Archaeologists call it the world's oldest continuously inhabited town, with a history stretching back over 11,000 years. At first glance, Jericho's significance might not be obvious. A cluster of mud brick houses, built close together. But hidden in its ruins lies a profound breakthrough, the earliest evidence of communal defense. Around 800 BC, the people of Jericho built a stone wall encircling their community, and within it, a mysterious round tower nearly 9 meters high. No one knows for certain why they built it. Some scholars believe it was protection against floods. Others think it defended against raiders. Still others suggest it was a ritual structure, linking the community to cosmic or spiritual forces. Whatever its purpose, it tells us something remarkable. For the first time, humans were building together not just for survival, but for permanence. Further north, in what is now Turkey, another settlement was pushing the boundaries of human imagination, Çatalhöyük. Dating back to around 7500 BC, it was unlike any place on Earth. Here, people built their homes so tightly packed together that there were no streets at all. Instead, residents entered their houses through ladders placed on the rooftops. The rooftops themselves served as pathways, connecting families like bridges in the sky. From above, the settlement resembled a honeycomb, with thousands of interconnected cells. This unique design offered safety. There were no ground-level doors for invaders to break through, and a sense of intimacy. Families lived literally wall to wall, sharing the rhythm of daily life. Inside the homes of Çatalhöyük, archaeologists have found extraordinary art. Murals of hunting scenes, vultures soaring above headless figures, and abstract patterns that may have symbolized fertility or cosmic order. Some houses contained plastered skulls of ancestors, carefully decorated with clay to preserve their features. These were not random decorations. They suggest that families were deeply tied to their past, and that honoring the dead was part of their identity as a community. Here, the seeds of religion, art, and collective memory intertwined. Other villages dotted the Fertile Crescent. At Abu Huraira in Syria, people experimented with early farming, blending it with hunting and gathering. At Tel es-Sawan in Iraq, families constructed rectangular houses with courtyards, hinting at the urban forms that would come later. Each of these places reveals a different way that humans were learning to adapt, test, and push the limits of settlement life. Living in permanent villages brought new challenges. Waste disposal, disease, and disputes over resources became pressing issues. When families lived shoulder to shoulder, arguments over water rights or land boundaries could no longer be solved by simply moving away. Instead, new forms of cooperation and leadership emerged. Perhaps a respected elder mediated disputes. Perhaps a group of families made collective decisions. Over time, these experiments in governance would evolve into councils, priesthoods, and eventually kingship. Economics, too, began to change. In a small nomadic band, everyone shared in the hunt. But in a village, not everyone farmed equally. Some became skilled at pottery, weaving, or toolmaking. Their goods could be traded for grain or meat. Slowly, a system of exchange developed. It was not yet money, but it was the beginning of a marketplace. And with markets came inequality. Those with more land or more productive fields gained influence. Those without depended on others. Society was beginning to stratify, layer by layer. The rivers were central to these developments. The annual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates brought fertility, but also danger. Early villages dug simple canals to channel water to their crops. It was labor-intensive, requiring cooperation among many families. The construction of these canals was more than an agricultural project. It was a social contract. To farm together meant to live together. The rivers, unpredictable and often violent, forced humans into solidarity. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these proto-towns is their creativity. From Jericho's tower to Çatalhöyük's murals, from shrines to household figurines, People were expressing ideas beyond mere survival. They were beginning to ask questions. Who are we as a community? How do we honor our ancestors? What forces control the floods, the rains, the harvests? In their answers, we see the first glimmers of culture as we know it: art, religion, politics, and identity. By the 6th millennium BC, these experiments in village life were spreading across Mesopotamia and beyond. Some would vanish, their mud walls melting back into the earth. Others would endure, growing larger and more complex. What united them was the recognition that humans could shape their environment, build structures that outlasted a single generation, and form bonds that went beyond family or tribe. These prototowns were not yet cities, but they were stepping stones. They carried within them the DNA of urban life: walls for defense, shrines for worship, markets for trade, and leaders for governance. The first cities of Sumer were still millennia away, but the path had already been laid. Humanity had crossed a threshold. The age of wandering was giving way to the age of building. If the rivers of Mesopotamia were the stage, agriculture was the script that set the story of civilization into motion. The agricultural revolution, which began slowly after 10,000 BC and accelerated over the next millennia, transformed human life more radically than almost any other development in history. It was not a single invention but a chain of discoveries, small adjustments that, taken together, changed the destiny of humankind. At first, farming was little more than gathering wild grains and experimenting with planting them near campsites. Families noticed that when seeds fell near their huts, new plants sprouted the following year. This simple observation was revolutionary. Humans could control growth rather than depend on chance. With each passing generation, they selected plants with larger seeds and sturdier stalks. Over centuries, wild grass evolved into cultivated wheat and barley. The same transformation happened with animals. Hunters who once pursued wild aurochs, massive, horned ancestors of cattle, began to capture and tame their young. Sheep and goats, easier to handle, were herded in pens. Pigs rooted through refuse and grew fat close to human homes. Domestication was not immediate. It was trial and error, often dangerous, but it offered something priceless: reliability. Instead of gambling on the hunt, people now had herds at their doorsteps and fields that promised food at the end of the season. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming created the first real surplus. A hunter could only bring home as much as he could carry. A gatherer could only collect what she found in a day. But a field of wheat, harvested at the right time, could feed a family for months. Surplus meant security. It meant survival through winters, droughts, or lean years. More importantly, it meant freedom. Not everyone had to farm. Some people could become potters, weavers, builders, or priests. This diversification of labor was the true beginning of complex society. But the land of Mesopotamia posed unique challenges. The southern plains received little rainfall. Without water, the soil turned to dust. The salvation came from the Tigris and Euphrates, whose floods brought life-giving silt. Yet the floods were unpredictable, sometimes gentle, sometimes catastrophic. To thrive here, people had to engineer the rivers. They dug canals and ditches, built levees to hold backwaters, and reservoirs to store them. This was the birth of irrigation agriculture, one of humanity's greatest inventions. Irrigation was more than technology, it was organization. A single family could not build a canal alone. Whole communities had to cooperate, to dig, maintain, and govern the flow of water. This demanded leadership. Decisions had to be made. Who controlled the canals, whose fields were watered first, who repaired the breaches after a flood. Out of irrigation came not only larger harvests, but also the first hints of politics and government. With farming came new rhythms of life. The calendar, once marked only by seasons of migration, now revolved around planting and harvest. Time became cyclical, measured by the sprouting of shoots, the ripening of barley, and the gathering of crops. Religious festivals emerged in step with these cycles, thanking the gods for abundance or pleading with them during drought. Farming was no longer just labor. It was tied to the sacred. Agriculture also reshaped the physical world. Forests were cleared, fields expanded, and wetlands drained. The environment itself bore the marks of human ambition. Settlements grew larger as food supported more people. Houses became sturdier, built with mud brick rather than reeds. Storage rooms, granaries, and courtyards appeared, signs of planning for the future rather than living day by day. The agricultural revolution was not without cost. Diets narrowed as people relied heavily on grains, leading to malnutrition compared to the varied foods of hunter-gatherers. Living close to animals spread new diseases. Hard labor bent backs and wore down bones. Hierarchies deepened. Those with fertile fields thrived, while others became laborers or dependents. In solving the problem of survival, humans had created new problems of inequality and health. Yet the gains outweighed the losses. Farming gave humans the confidence to imagine permanence. No longer at the mercy of chance, they could plan, accumulate, and invest in the future. Surplus food supported growing populations, trade with neighbors, and the birth of specialization. Pottery for storage, weaving for clothing, and metallurgy for tools all blossomed because agriculture freed hands from the endless chase for food. By the 5th millennium BC, farming villages dotted the Mesopotamian landscape. The Fertile Crescent was no longer a frontier of experiment, but a patchwork of thriving communities bound to their fields and flocks. Slowly, these villages would merge into towns, and towns into cities. From the sowing of seeds came the sowing of civilization itself. The agricultural revolution was humanity's first great gamble, a bet that humans could bend nature to their will rather than wander in its shadow. And though the gamble brought hardship as well as abundance, it laid the foundation for everything that followed: temples, writing, empires, and the endless story of human ambition. As villages grew and fields spread across the floodplains, the people of Mesopotamia began to look beyond survival. They had learned to tame the rivers, to store grain, to raise herds, but they also sought meaning in the unpredictable world around them. Why did floods come some years and not others? Why did crops sometimes flourish and sometimes wither? Why did life end in sickness, storms, or war? The answers, they believed, rested with unseen powers, gods and spirits who governed the forces of nature. Out of this search for order arose one of humanity's most enduring inventions, the temple. The earliest shrines were humble. A few stones arranged in circles, a figurine buried beneath a house, a hearth kept burning to honor ancestors or local spirits. But as communities became more permanent, these spiritual spaces grew larger and more elaborate. In villages like Eridu, one of the oldest known settlements in southern Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered layer upon layer of temples built one atop another for more than 2,000 years. Each generation rebuilt the sacred site, making it larger, more decorated, and more central to community life. Eridu's temple began as a small mud brick shrine, barely the size of a single room. Centuries later, it stood as a massive platform structure, a ziggurat in miniature. Temples were not just religious centers. They were the beating heart of early society. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, the temple embodied the community's shared hopes and fears. It was where people gathered to offer grain, beer, or animals to the gods. It was where rituals marked the cycles of planting and harvest. And it was where leaders, first priests, later kings, mediated between the human and the divine. The symbolism of these temples reveals much about Mesopotamian thought. They were often built on raised platforms, as if lifting humanity closer to the heavens. Their inner chambers contained altars, sacred statues, or offerings, hidden from the public but tended by priests. Murals and carvings showed animals, water, and celestial symbols, linking daily survival to cosmic order. To enter a temple was to step into a space where earth and sky met, where humans could touch the eternal. Priests quickly became powerful figures. They were not just spiritual guides, but also managers. They organized offerings, distributed surplus grain, and oversaw irrigation projects dedicated to the gods. In many early towns, the temple was also the granary, the storehouse, and the administrative office. Clay tokens used for accounting were often found in temple precincts. This suggests that religion and economics were inseparable. Faith in the gods justified the redistribution of resources, while offerings sustained the social and political structure. Temples also anchored identity. In settlements without walls or armies, the shrine was what bound people together. Families might quarrel over land, but all shared loyalty to the same deity. The god or goddess of a village was both protector and judge, the symbol of its survival. Over time, as towns grew into cities, these local gods became patrons of entire urban centers. Inanna of Uruk, Enki of Eridu, Nana of Uar. To worship the god was to pledge loyalty to the city itself. One striking example of this intertwining is the White Temple of Uruk, built around 3500 BC. Rising on a platform high above the city, its gleaming plaster walls would have shone in the desert sun. From miles away, travelers could see it and know they were approaching a place protected by the gods. Inside, offerings of bread, beer, and incense burned day and night, a reminder that the city lived only by divine favor. Yet temples were not static monuments. They were centers of innovation. Within their walls, scribes developed writing to record offerings and transactions. Architects experimented with new forms of construction. Artists carved cylinder seals that doubled as both devotional images and administrative tools. What began as a house for the gods became the workshop of civilization itself. But temples also embodied inequality. While priests lived close to the divine, ordinary farmers labored in the fields. Offerings came from the surplus of many, funneled into the rituals of the few. The gods demanded sacrifice, and through them, the temple demanded labor, grain, and obedience. Faith inspired unity, but it also justified hierarchy. In this way, religion shaped not only spirituality, but politics and power. Still, the importance of the temple cannot be overstated. For early Mesopotamians, life was fragile, uncertain, and often cruel. The temple offered stability. It was a place where human effort met divine will, where chaos was given meaning. The shrines of Eridu, the White Temple of Uruk, and countless others were more than buildings. They were the first great symbols of humanity's attempt to find order in a world of unpredictability. In these sacred spaces, people learned to gather, to plan, to create. They learned to see themselves not just as families or tribes, but as communities bound together by a shared devotion. And in doing so, they took another step toward the invention of civilization. Before kings raised their palaces or empires stretched across Mesopotamia, another revolution was quietly unfolding, one that would outlast dynasties, survive conquests, and shape every civilization to come. It was the invention of writing. But like all great human achievements, it began not with grandeur, but with something simple: the need to keep track of things. In the earliest villages, people bartered face to face. A goat traded for grain, a jar of oil exchanged for wool. Trust was personal, memory was enough. But as communities grew, so did complexity. Temples collected offerings. Farmers delivered surplus. Merchants carried goods across long distances. Suddenly, memory was no longer sufficient. Who owed what? How much had been paid? When was the harvest due? Out of this problem arose a solution both ingenious and humble: clay tokens. These small objects, no bigger than a thumb, were shaped into spheres, cones, and cylinders. Each shape represented a specific good: a cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for livestock, a cylinder for oil. When transactions took place, tokens recorded them. If a farmer delivered 5 baskets of barley to the temple, 5 cone-shaped tokens were set aside. These tokens were then stored in clay envelopes, called bulli, which could be sealed with impressions to prevent tampering. Break the envelope, and the tokens revealed the record inside. Over centuries, this system grew more sophisticated. Rather than keeping the tokens hidden, people began pressing them directly into wet clay tablets, leaving permanent impressions. Soon, the impressions became stylized drawings, pictographs scratched with a reed stylus. A simple triangle might stand for a sheaf of grain, a circle for a sheep. What began as a tally system evolved into symbolic communication. The first step toward writing had been taken. By around 3200 BC, in the bustling city of Uruk, these symbols had multiplied. Tablets no longer recorded only goods, but also names, places, and administrative details. At first, it was practical: shipments of barley, lists of workers, temple inventories. But once the idea existed that marks on clay could capture information, the possibilities expanded. Words could outlast voices. Agreements could survive memory. Power could be written down. This early script became what we call cuneiform, named for its wedge-shaped marks impressed into clay with a cut reed stylus. The symbols grew abstract, no longer simple pictures, but strokes and wedges arranged in complex patterns. Learning them required training, and so the first scribes emerged. These men, and occasionally women, spent years mastering the hundreds of signs needed to record language. Their schools, called adubas, drilled students in copying lists, contracts, and hymns. To be a scribe was to hold immense power, for knowledge itself became a tool of authority. Writing transformed society. Temples could track offerings, kings could issue decrees, merchants could sign contracts. The economy could expand beyond personal trust, because transactions were now documented. Law became more stable, because rules could be inscribed and displayed. Religion grew more formal, as hymns and myths were written down, preserving rituals across generations. Writing was not simply a convenience. It was the foundation of civilization itself. And yet, in its earliest days, writing was not meant for poetry or philosophy. It was meant for numbers, for lists, for accountability. Some of the oldest surviving tablets are receipts. 29,086 measures of barley, received over 37 months, signed by the temple steward. Dry as they may seem, these tablets reveal something profound. The moment humanity realized it could anchor memory outside the human brain. With clay and reed, thought itself became permanent. Over time, writing leapt from administration into imagination. Scribes began to use cuneiform not just for records, but for stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, hymns to Inanna, proverbs and riddles, all found their way onto clay. Writing gave humans the ability to dream across centuries, to pass wisdom, fears, and questions far beyond the lifespan of a single storyteller. But writing also deepened inequality. To read and write was a specialized skill, limited to elites and administrators. Scribes served temples, palaces, and merchants, ensuring that those in power had greater control over knowledge. For most farmers and laborers, the clay tablet was a mysterious object, carrying authority but not understanding. Literacy became both a tool of progress and a wall of separation. Even so, the legacy of Mesopotamian writing is astonishing. The sexagesimal number system, born in temple accounting, still lingers in our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. The wedge-shaped cuneiform script, adapted from many languages over 2,000 years, spread ideas across empires. Without Mesopotamia's invention, there would be no law codes carved in stone, no letters sent across kingdoms, no histories to connect past and future. From tokens in a clay envelope to libraries of thousands of tablets, the journey of writing began here, in the land between rivers. What started as a way to count sheep became a way to capture the human soul. And in doing so, it changed the course of history forever. When we imagine the dawn of civilization, we often think of pyramids or marble temples. But long before Egypt or Greece, in the dusty plains of southern Mesopotamia, two cities, Uruk and Eridu, rose from the marshes and deserts to become the world's first urban centers. Their mud-brick walls, bustling markets, and sacred temples gave humanity something new. The city as an idea, a place where thousands of lives converged in shared purpose. Eridu, the first sacred city. According to Sumerian tradition, Eridu was the very first city ever founded. Myths even claimed it was created by the gods themselves, a gift from the heavens to humankind. Archaeology tells a story nearly as astonishing. Around 5000 BC, in the far south where the Euphrates once met the Persian Gulf, settlers built small mud brick houses beside a temple dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. Over centuries, layer upon layer of temples rose on the same sacred spot, each new structure built atop the ruins of the last. By the 3rd millennium BC, the site contained more than a dozen layers of temples, stacked like a cake of history. The priests of Eridu controlled water, knowledge, and ritual. To live in this city was to live under the shadow of the divine. People gathered not only to farm but to worship, to make offerings, to believe that their city was chosen. Though never as large as Uruk, Eridu set the pattern for urban life. A sacred precinct at the heart, houses clustered around, canals dug to bring water, and walls to mark a community's identity. It was here that the city first became a symbol, not just a settlement, but a spiritual center, an earthly reflection of cosmic order. Uruk, the first great city. If Eridu was the spiritual birthplace, Uruk was the practical powerhouse. Around 4000 BC, Uruk began to swell into something unprecedented. By 3200 BC, it may have housed 40,000 to 50,000 people, numbers staggering for the time. Its size alone made it the world's first true city, dwarfing any other settlement. Uruk's skyline was dominated by temple complexes. The White Temple, gleaming under the Mesopotamian sun, perched on a massive platform, an early prototype of a ziggurat. Nearby, the Inanna precinct honored the goddess Inanna, patroness of love and war. These sacred districts were not merely places of worship, they were administrative hubs, economic centers, and symbols of power. Temples owned farmland, managed workers, collected taxes, and stored surpluses. Religion and administration fused into one system of control. But Uruk was more than priests and temples. Its crowded neighborhoods buzzed with potters, metalworkers, weavers, and merchants. Workshops turned out goods in quantities never before seen, fueled by the city's demand and organized trade. Markets thrived, where goods from distant lands, obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, shells from the Gulf, passed through Uruk's gates. For the first time, long-distance trade fed a city's appetite. The wall and the king. The city was so important that it later gave its name to an entire age, the Uruk period. It was also remembered in legend, most famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The tale begins with the king of Uruk, Gilgamesh himself, boasting of a city's mighty walls. Walls so vast and strong that even in ruins today they stretch for miles. Whether or not the historical Gilgamesh truly built them, the image of Uruk's walls became a metaphor for civilization itself. Protection, permanence, and human ingenuity pressed into clay and stone. Life inside the city. Life in Uruk was not easy. Crowded streets, mud brick houses jammed wall to wall, no air conditioning in the searing Mesopotamian heat. People climbed ladders to flat rooftops to catch evening breezes. Streets rang with the sounds of donkeys braying, potters shaping clay, and children darting between vendors. Water channels cut through neighborhoods, both lifelines and hazards when flooding struck. Yet for all its difficulties, the city offered opportunities unknown in the countryside. A farmer's son could become a potter, a soldier, or even a scribe. Women worked in textile workshops and managed household businesses. Diversity grew, different languages, traditions, and skills mixing in crowded markets. The city became a melting pot of humanity. The idea of the city. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Uruk and Eridu was not their temples or trade, but the very concept of city life itself. Humans discovered that living together in such numbers required new rules, governance, law, distribution, defense. Families no longer survived alone, but as part of a larger organism. The city became a living entity, greater than the sum of its parts. The rise of these cities transformed Mesopotamia. They created elites and commoners, priests and merchants, kings and laborers. They forged identities around walls, gods, and markets. And they showed that humanity could build something larger, more enduring, than any tribe or clan. Uruk and Eridu were not just places. They were turning points, the moment the village became the city, and the city became the engine of civilization. As Mesopotamian villages swelled into cities, something inevitable followed, the need for leadership. Irrigation canals had to be dug and maintained. Disputes over water had to be settled. Markets needed regulation, and armies had to be organized when rival cities clashed. At first, councils of elders or assemblies of citizens handled these affairs. But as societies grew larger and more complex, leadership shifted toward a new figure, the king. From priest to king. In the earliest days, temple priests held the most authority. They managed grain stores, directed laborers, and claimed insight into the god's will. Temples were not only religious centers, but also economic engines. To question the priest was to question the gods themselves. Yet crises often demanded a different kind of leader. When floods swept across fields or hostile neighbors threatened the walls, cities turned to a temporary military commander. Over time, these commanders, called Lugal meaning big man, stopped giving up power once the danger passed. Instead, they consolidated it. They surrounded themselves with loyal retainers, claimed divine favor, and gradually transformed temporary command into permanent kingship. What had begun as a practical necessity became the foundation of monarchy. The first dynasties. By the early 3rd millennium BC, many Mesopotamian cities were ruled by dynasties, families who passed power from father to son. Each city had its own line of kings, recorded proudly in inscriptions and later compiled into the Sumerian king list. This remarkable text, part history and part legend, describes rulers who reigned for centuries, even thousands of years, before the Great Flood. Whether mythical or historical, the king list shows how deeply kingship had become woven into Mesopotamian identity. In cities like Ur, Kish, Lagash, and Uruk, dynasties competed for dominance. Some kings left behind extravagant tombs, such as those of Ur's royal cemetery, filled with gold, jewelry, musical instruments, and even attendants sacrificed to serve their ruler in the afterlife. These burials reveal the wealth and power concentrated in royal hands, and the stark inequalities that came with monarchy. Kings and the gods. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs, Mesopotamian kings were not usually considered gods themselves, at least not at first. Instead, they were chosen representatives, mediators between humans and the divine. Kings built temples, offered sacrifices, and claimed victories were granted by patron gods. To rule without divine approval was unthinkable. Royal inscriptions frequently emphasized this connection. A king might describe himself as shepherd of the people, chosen by Nana, or mighty warrior, appointed by Enlil. The imagery was deliberate. Kingship was not just politics but theology. When a ruler succeeded, it proved the gods favored him. When he failed, it suggested the gods had withdrawn support. The burden of rule. Kingship was not merely glory. It carried heavy responsibility. Kings had to provide justice, maintain irrigation systems, protect trade routes, and defend city walls. If crops failed or floods destroyed fields, blame often fell on the ruler. People expected their king to uphold me, the Sumerian concept of cosmic order. Failure risked revolt, or worse, divine punishment. The earliest law codes reflect this burden. Though Hammurabi's famous stele would come later, fragments of earlier laws from city-states like Ishnana and Lagash show kings striving to regulate commerce, protect the weak, and impose fairness. The role of king was thus both judge and general, administrator and priest. Rivalries and wars. As kingship solidified, rivalries intensified. Each city-state sought control over fertile land and critical waterways. Boundaries blurred, alliances shifted, and wars became frequent. The earliest recorded battle dates back over 4,500 years, carved in relief on the stele of the vultures from Lagash. It shows soldiers in tight phalanxes, spears bristling, marching under the command of their king. War was now organized, disciplined, and fought in the name of both king and god. These conflicts also fueled innovation. Kings commissioned stronger walls, better weapons, and more efficient administration to support their campaigns. Warfare, though destructive, accelerated the consolidation of state power. The legacy of early kingship. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, kingship had become an institution, as natural to Mesopotamians as sunrise and flood. The idea of hereditary dynasties ruling in the name of gods would echo across history, from pharaohs to emperors, from medieval kings to modern monarchies. What began as a big man chosen in a crisis became the blueprint for centralized authority across the ancient world. Kingship also left behind stories that still resonate. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just a tale of friendship and mortality, but also a reflection on kingship itself. The struggle to balance power with justice, ambition with duty, mortality with legacy. It asks a question that has haunted rulers ever since. How should a king be remembered? The birth of kingship in Mesopotamia was not merely about who wielded power, but about how societies imagined order, justice, and connection to the divine. It was the moment humanity accepted that leadership could outlast a single crisis, and that authority, once given, might never be returned. For centuries, Mesopotamia was a land of city-states, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, each proud, independent, and often at war with its neighbors. But in the 24th century BC, a man from the north rose with a vision no one had dared before, to unite these squabbling cities under one rule. His name was Sargon, and his ambition gave the world its first empire. Humble origins, legendary birth. Sargon's life reads like legend. Later stories claimed he was born the illegitimate son of a priestess and abandoned at birth. Placed in a basket of reeds, he floated down the Euphrates until rescued by a gardener, who raised him as his own. Much like the later tale of Moses, this myth framed Sargon as a man chosen by destiny, lifted from obscurity to greatness. What we do know is that Sargon began his career as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a trusted servant in the royal court. But he was no ordinary servant. He was ambitious, cunning, and skilled in both politics and war. Around 2334 BC, he seized power in Kish, establishing his base before turning his gaze southward to the wealthy Sumerian cities. Conquering the south. At the time, The southern plain was dominated by Lugal-Zagizi, a powerful king of Uruk, who had briefly united many Sumerian cities. The clash between Sargon and Lugal-Zagizi was more than a struggle of men. It was a clash between two visions of rule. Lugal-Zagizi sought to maintain the traditional city-state system under his paramount authority. Sargon dreamed of something bigger, a unified realm with himself as the center. Through a series of brilliant campaigns, Sargon defeated Lugal-Zagizi's forces, captured Uruk, and paraded his rival in chains through the city gates. From there, Sargon extended his power across the south, eventually controlling all of Sumer. But he did not stop at the old boundaries of the land between the rivers. His armies pushed west to the Mediterranean and east into Iran, creating a realm stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant. Innovation of empire. What made Sargon's achievement revolutionary was not just the scale of conquest, but the way he governed. Previous conquerors had often allowed local rulers to remain in place, paying tribute. Sargon instead removed defeated kings and installed his own governors, often his sons and trusted officials, answerable only to him. He centralized power in a way no one had before. He also built a standing army, reportedly 5,400 strong, who ate bread daily before him. Unlike citizen militias raised in times of need, this permanent force ensured loyalty and readiness. It was the first professional army in recorded history, and it made the Akkadian Empire possible. Sargon standardized weights, measures, and even language. While Sumerian continued as a sacred tongue, Akkadian, the Semitic language Sargon spoke, became the language of administration across his empire. This linguistic shift not only unified diverse peoples, but also marked the beginning of Akkadians' dominance in the region for centuries. A new image of kingship. Sargon reshaped the very idea of kingship. He was not simply the ruler of one city, nor even king of Sumer. He styled himself king of the four quarters of the world. His inscriptions proclaimed his victories and divine favor, painting him as a figure chosen by the gods to rule all lands. In doing so, he laid down the model for later rulers from Hammurabi to Alexander. The king as world conqueror. Challenges of power. But empire came with challenges. Rebellions flared constantly. The further his armies marched, the harder it became to maintain control. City-states that had flourished independently for centuries resisted central authority, and Sargon's governors faced constant uprisings. Yet his reign, which lasted more than 50 years, proved long enough to entrench the idea of empire in Mesopotamian political thought. When he died, his successors, his sons Rimish and Manishtushu, and later his grandson Naram-Sin, struggled to preserve his legacy. Some were assassinated, others victorious, but the empire endured for nearly 2 centuries. It was fragile, often contested, but it had set a precedent. From now on, kings would dream not of cities, but of empires. Legacy of Sargon. Sargon's story resonates because it is both ancient and familiar. A man of uncertain birth, rising through ambition and skill, reshaping his world by sheer determination. His empire was the prototype of all that followed: Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Rome. His name remained legendary for millennia. Even Assyrian kings 2,000 years later claimed descent from him, invoking his memory to legitimize their own conquests. Though the Akkadian Empire eventually fell to rebellion and invasion, its impact was permanent. It introduced the world to the idea that diverse peoples, languages, and lands could be bound together under a single authority. And it proved that one man's ambition could redraw the map of human history. From a basket on the Euphrates to the throne of the world, Sargon's journey marked a turning point. With him, Mesopotamia moved from city-states to empire, and humanity took its first bold step into imperial ambition. When Sargon's empire passed to his descendants, it entered both glory and danger. His sons Rimish and Manishtushu struggled with revolts, both dying violently. But the empire survived. It was Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who would not only restore stability but take Akkadian kingship to a new and daring level by declaring himself a god. A grandson of empire, Naram-Sin inherited a fragile throne around 2254 BC. The empire stretched wide but trembled under constant rebellions. Subject cities longed for independence, mountain tribes raided borders, and governors built personal power bases. Yet Naram-Sin proved ruthless and brilliant. Early in his reign, he crushed a massive coalition of rebel cities, defeating their armies and reasserting Akkadian dominance. One stele, the victory stele of Naram-Sin, immortalizes this triumph. Carved in pink limestone, it shows the king striding up a mountain, trampling enemies beneath his feet. He towers over his soldiers, helmet crowned with horns, the symbol of divinity. Unlike earlier Mesopotamian art, which showed kings in orderly processions, this image depicts Naram-Sin as larger than life, almost godlike. The message was clear. This was no ordinary king. The king is God. In a bold departure from tradition, Naram-Sin declared himself divine. He ordered his name written with the cuneiform determinative for God, previously reserved for deities. Temples were dedicated to him across the empire, and statues depicted him with the horned crown of immortals. Why this audacious move? Perhaps it was a strategy to unify a diverse, rebellious empire under a single figure who was more than mortal. Perhaps it reflected his own ambition, a belief that his victories proved he stood apart. Either way, Naram-Sin reshaped kingship forever. No longer merely chosen by the gods, he was a god, at least within his empire. This declaration shocked many. In Mesopotamian tradition, kings were intermediaries, not divine beings. Some subjects may have embraced it as a source of order, while others viewed it as hubris. Later Mesopotamian writers would condemn Naram-Sin's pride, blaming it for the empire's eventual fall. Yet in his own time, the divine kingship gave him immense symbolic power, expansion, and prosperity. Naram-Sin extended his empire further than Sargon himself. His armies marched into the Zagros Mountains, securing timber and metal from distant lands. Trade routes flourished under imperial protection, connecting Mesopotamia to Anatolia, Iran, and the Levant. Caravans carried lapis lazuli, copper, and precious woods into Akkadian cities, enriching palaces and temples. At home, Naram-Sin reinforced imperial administration. Governors ruled provinces directly under his authority, supported by professional scribes and soldiers. Records show detailed accounting of goods, workers, and tribute, evidence of a highly organized bureaucracy. The empire functioned as a machine, powered by agriculture and trade, directed from the royal court. Cracks in the empire. But even as Naram-Sin expanded his glory, cracks appeared. The sheer size of the empire strained communication. Governors sometimes acted independently. Rebellions simmered in outlying cities, suppressed but never extinguished. Most ominous of all were pressures from beyond Mesopotamia's borders. Nomadic tribes and highland peoples, particularly the Gutians from the Zagros, grew bolder. Inscriptions describe them as wild and lawless, who know no gods, who do not bury their dead. Whether exaggerated or not, their raids destabilized the empire's fragile frontier. Naram-Sin fought back fiercely, leading campaigns against these threats. Yet the constant drain of resources wore down the empire's strength. Later Mesopotamian traditions claimed that after sacking the holy city of Nippur, Naram-Sin brought down the god's wrath, dooming Akkad. Whether myth or memory, the story reflects how contemporaries struggled to explain the collapse of what had seemed invincible. A legacy of hubris and power. Naram-Sin reigned for over 3 decades. When he died, the empire still stood, but weakened. Within a century, It would fall to invasions, rebellions, and famine, its glory dissolved. Yet his legacy endured. He had pushed the idea of kingship to its extreme, the ruler not just as servant of the gods, but as divine himself. Later Mesopotamian kings remembered him with both awe and warning. Some admired his victories and power. Others cited him as proof that arrogance brings destruction. His divine kingship would echo through history, influencing pharaohs of Egypt, emperors of Rome, and countless rulers who claimed semi-divine status. The victory stele of Naram-Sin, still surviving in a museum thousands of years later, captures this paradox perfectly. A man who dared to rise like a god, towering over enemies, ascending the mountain of conquest, yet whose empire, like all before and after, would one day crumble into dust. Every empire imagines itself eternal. Sargon's dream and Naram-Sin's divine ambition seemed, for a moment, unshakable. Yet even the mightiest walls cannot withstand time, famine, and enemies at the gates. By the end of the 23rd century BC, the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in human history, was unraveling. Its downfall came not from a single battle, but from a slow storm of rebellion, exhaustion, and invasion. A weakened inheritance. When Naram-Sin died, his successors inherited both his throne and his troubles. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, but holding it together required constant campaigns, endless tribute, and unyielding control. Every corner of the empire simmered with unrest. Cities that had once bowed to Akkad's power now plotted rebellion the moment the army marched elsewhere. Records suggest that famine and drought struck the land during this period. Crops withered, irrigation systems strained, and grain prices soared. For people dependent on harvest cycles, this was catastrophic. Hunger bred discontent, and discontent bred revolt. The empire's foundations began to crack. Who were the Gudians? Into this turmoil stepped the Gudians, tribes from the Zagros Mountains to the east. Mesopotamian scribes described them in scathing terms. People who know no gods, who cannot write, who live like animals. To the city dwellers, they were the embodiment of chaos, uncivilized, lawless, and brutal. Yet these mountain tribes had one advantage: mobility. Where Akkad's armies moved slowly with supply trains and chariots, the Gudians struck quickly, raiding towns, stealing livestock, and retreating to the hills. Over time, their attacks became more frequent, more coordinated. They were no longer just raiders. They were conquerors pressing into the heart of Mesopotamia. Collapse of control. Akkadian rulers after Naram-Sin, like Sharkali-Shari, struggled desperately to keep control. Inscriptions speak of constant wars on every front. Elamites to the east, Amorites to the west, Gudians pressing down from the north. The once unified empire fractured under the strain. Provincial governors carved out local power bases. Trade routes collapsed. Sharkali-Shari, despite his efforts, could not stem the tide. After his death, chaos deepened. A later Mesopotamian chronicle, The Curse of Akkad, portrays this period as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's arrogance. In the story, he defied the god Enlil by sacking the holy city of Nippur, bringing down the god's wrath on his dynasty. Whether myth or metaphor, the tale captured a truth. The empire had lost its divine mandate in the eyes of its people. The Gudian rule. By around 2154 BC, the Gudians had seized much of Mesopotamia, toppling what remained of Akkad's authority. They did not build a new empire in its place. Instead, they ruled loosely, raiding and collecting tribute without creating the administrative structures needed to sustain civilization. Mesopotamian scribes loathed them. Later texts describe Gudian rule as a dark age. Irrigation left untended, fields barren, temples neglected, writing forgotten. One lament claimed, "They filled Sumer with corpses. They made the fields bare. They let no seed sprout." These accounts may exaggerate, painting the Gutians as villains to emphasize the later Sumerian revival, but they reveal how traumatic this period felt to those who lived it. A memory of ruin. For nearly a century, Mesopotamia languished under Gutian dominance. Cities that had once pulsed with life grew quiet. Trade diminished. The grandeur of Akkad, the empire that had united the land between rivers, was gone. When later kings looked back, they spoke of Akkad with both admiration and warning, a reminder that even the greatest power can crumble overnight. The fall of Akkad left an enduring scar on Mesopotamian memory. The curse of Akkad, the laments, the hostile descriptions of the Gutians, all reflect a society struggling to explain how the world's first empire could vanish. Was it divine wrath, human arrogance, environmental collapse, or simply the relentless pressure of enemies who would not yield? The seeds of renewal. Yet even in this darkness, seeds of renewal were germinating. Local rulers in cities like Lagash and Ur quietly rebuilt strength, restoring irrigation and reviving temple life. From these centers would rise a new age, the Neo-Sumerian revival, led by kings who look back to the glory of old Sumer while learning from Akkad's imperial experiment. The Gutians, once feared as unstoppable, would eventually fade, their names remembered only as symbols of chaos. But their role in history was pivotal. By bringing down Akkad, they reminded Mesopotamia and the world that no empire, however mighty, lasts forever. The story of Akkad's fall is thus both tragedy and lesson. It shows the fragility of human achievement, the way drought, rebellion, and foreign invasion can topple even the most brilliant of creations. But it also sets the stage for renewal, for in the ruins of Akkad, new civilizations would rise, carrying forward the legacy of the first empire while reshaping it for the future. Out of the ruins left by the Gutians, a remarkable rebirth took place in southern Mesopotamia. For nearly a century, chaos had reigned, fields untended, trade disrupted, temples neglected. Yet Mesopotamia was never destined to remain broken. Around 2112 BC, a new dynasty rose from the ancient city of Ur, reviving the Sumerian spirit while blending it with the lessons of Akkadian empire building. Historians call this the Neo-Sumerian period or the Ur-3 dynasty. It was a moment of renaissance, one last great flowering of Sumerian culture before history turned its gaze elsewhere. The rise of Ur-Nammu. The story begins with Ur-Nammu, the founding king. Rising from the city of Ur, he expelled the Gutians and re-established control over much of southern Mesopotamia. Unlike Sargon or Naram-Sin, who emphasized conquest, Ur-Nammu's legacy lay in construction, law, and order. He presented himself not as a divine conqueror, but as a restorer of balance, chosen by the gods to heal the land after years of turmoil. Ur-Nammu's most enduring achievement was his law code, the oldest known in history, predating Hammurabi by more than 3 centuries. Though only fragments survive, they reveal a vision of justice based not only on punishment, but on restitution. Rather than an endless cycle of revenge, wrongs could be compensated with fixed fines. The code sought to protect widows, orphans, and the poor from exploitation by the powerful. In a time scarred by violence, this emphasis on fairness was revolutionary. The glory of ziggurats. Ur-Nammu also launched a massive building program that transformed the skyline of Sumerian cities. His crowning achievements were ziggurats, towering step temples that rose like mountains above the flat Mesopotamian plain. The most famous, the Great Ziggurat of Ur, still stands in ruins today, its baked bricks weathered by 4,000 years. These monumental structures symbolized more than religion. They proclaimed a revival of civilization itself. Each brick was stamped with Ur-Nammu's name, a reminder that kingship was restored, temples renewed, and the gods honored. Pilgrims ascended staircases to make offerings at the summit, reaffirming the sacred link between heaven and earth. Shulgi, the great organizer. Uarnamu's son, Shulgi, inherited the throne and ruled for an astonishing 48 years. If his father laid the foundations, Shulgi built the empire's full structure. He was both warrior and bureaucrat, poet and politician. His reign represented the height of the Neo-Sumerian revival. Shulgi reorganized the administration into one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies the ancient world had seen. Governors ruled provinces, scribes maintained detailed records, and royal inspectors traveled the countryside to enforce standards. Taxes were collected in grain, livestock, or labor, fueling state-run farms, workshops, and armies. The king even standardized weights, measures, and a calendar, ensuring uniformity across his domain. Propaganda played its part too. Hymns praised Shulgi as a tireless runner, claiming he could cover 100 miles in a single day to bring offerings between temples. Whether fact or fiction, the image reinforced his role as a unifier of the land and servant of the gods. In later years, like his grandfather Naram-Sin, Shulgi declared himself divine, cementing his image as both king and god. Prosperity and culture. Under Shulgi, trade networks revived. Goods flowed again from Anatolia, Iran, and the Gulf. Temples hummed with activity, scribal schools flourished, and literature blossomed. Many Sumerian myths and hymns were standardized during this period, preserving cultural traditions that might otherwise have vanished. The Ur-3 dynasty also left behind tens of thousands of clay tablets, administrative records of staggering detail. They list everything from grain rations for workers to the distribution of beer at festivals. Through them, historians glimpse daily life: shepherds tending flocks, weavers producing textiles, priests recording offerings. Rarely in ancient history is a society's inner life so well documented. The beginning of decline. Yet even this renaissance could not last forever. Shulgi's successors struggled with rising challenges. The empire's vast bureaucracy, once a strength, became a burden, consuming enormous resources. Provinces grew restless under heavy taxation. Nomadic groups pressed in from the deserts and mountains, straining the army. Most damaging of all was environmental decline. Centuries of irrigation had left fields waterlogged and salty. Yields fell, grain prices soared, and famine returned. Texts record desperate attempts to maintain stability, but the land itself was turning against its farmers. By the reign of Ibbi-Sin, the last king of Ur, the empire was crumbling. Enemies closed in, provinces seceded, and finally, in 2004 BC, Elamite invaders captured Ur. The great ziggurat was defiled, the royal family carried away. A lament poem mourned, "The city has been destroyed. Its people walk like ghosts." The last flowering of Sumer. Though the Ur-3 dynasty fell, its impact endured. It preserved Sumerian language, literature, and religious traditions for centuries to come. Its ziggurats inspired later Babylonian and Assyrian temples. Its law code foreshadowed Hammurabi's more famous stele. And its administrative tablets remain one of history's richest archives, a window into daily life 4,000 years ago. The Neo-Sumerian revival was a reminder that even after collapse, civilizations can rise again, blending old traditions with new innovations. It was the last great flowering of Sumer, a golden sunset before the land between rivers shifted toward new powers, Babylon, Assyria, and beyond. When Ur fell in 2004 BC, Sumer's long story entered its final chapter. The proud city-states lingered, but none could restore the unity once brought by Sargon or Shulgi. Into this fractured landscape stepped a city that had been little more than a regional town during earlier centuries, Babylon. From humble beginnings, it would grow into one of the most famous names in world history. From small town to rising power. At first, Babylon was hardly destined for greatness. It was one city among many in central Mesopotamia, competing with rivals like Isin, Larsa, and Ishnana. But its location proved decisive. Sitting along the Euphrates, it commanded key trade routes and fertile fields. Clever rulers exploited these advantages, slowly building strength. The turning point came under Hammurabi, who took the throne in 1792 BC. He was not the first king of Babylon, but he was the one who transformed it from a modest kingdom into a true empire. Patient, shrewd, and relentless, Hammurabi mastered the art of waiting until rivals exhausted themselves, then striking with precision. The conquests of Hammurabi. At the start of his reign, Babylon was surrounded by stronger states. To the south, Larsa controlled rich farmlands. To the east, Elam threatened with powerful armies. To the north, Assyria and Mari competed for influence. Hammurabi bided his time, consolidating Babylon internally while forging alliances and playing enemies against each other. When the moment was right, he moved. Over 3 decades, through wars and diplomacy, Hammurabi absorbed rival cities, one by one. By the 1750s BC, his banners flew over nearly all of Mesopotamia. Like Sargon before him, he had forged an empire from the land between rivers. But Hammurabi would be remembered not only for conquest, but for something more enduring: law. The Code of Hammurabi. Carved into a tall blackstone stele, the Code of Hammurabi remains one of history's most iconic legal texts. At its top, a carved relief shows Hammurabi receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god of justice. Beneath, nearly 300 laws cover every aspect of life: contracts, wages, marriage, inheritance, property, even medical malpractice. The code's principle was simple: order must prevail. If a man stole, he paid. If a builder's house collapsed, killing its owner, the builder faced death. If a doctor's treatment went wrong, he could be punished severely. Harsh as these laws sound today, they represented a crucial idea. Justice came not from personal vengeance, but from a public standard applied to all. The code also protected the vulnerable. Widows and orphans were not to be exploited. Tenants had rights against landlords. Even slaves had limited protections. Though the law preserved inequality, it punished nobles and commoners differently. The very act of writing rules in stone meant power was no longer purely arbitrary. A king as administrator. Hammurabi was not only a lawgiver, but a tireless administrator. Letters from his reign show him involved in everything: irrigation projects, temple maintenance, judicial cases, even disputes over stolen donkeys. He micromanaged officials, punished corruption, and made sure the canals that sustained agriculture were kept flowing. This hands-on governance created stability. Farmers could plant with confidence, merchants could trade securely, and priests could perform rituals without fear of chaos. Babylon became not just a city of conquest, but a center of administration, religion, and culture. The ideology of kingship. Hammurabi presented himself as chosen by the gods to bring justice. In the prologue to his code, he declared he was called by Anu and Enlil to make justice prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked, and to protect the weak. This balance between divine authority and human responsibility became the template for later Mesopotamian kingship. Unlike Naram-Sin, Hammurabi did not claim to be a god himself. Instead, he cast himself as a servant of divine will, a man who ruled because the gods had entrusted him with their mandate. This made his laws not just political rules, but sacred obligations. Legacy of Hammurabi. When Hammurabi died around 1750 BC, he left behind a unified Mesopotamian state and a cultural model that would endure for centuries. His empire did not last long. His successors faced revolts and invasions, but his vision of kingship, justice, and administration shaped the memory of Babylon forever. The Code of Hammurabi survived because later rulers copied and studied it. In fact, its influence stretched far beyond Mesopotamia. The very concept that laws should be written, public, and binding resonates through history, echoing in Roman law, medieval codes, and even modern legal systems. From Babylon to legend. In time, Babylon would rise and fall many times, but under Hammurabi it took its first great step into legend. It became a name that meant not just power, but order. A city where kings ruled with law carved in stone, where the vulnerable found some measure of protection, and where human ambition sought to mirror divine justice. The world's first empire had collapsed with Akkad, but Babylon proved that Mesopotamia still had lessons to teach. Through Hammurabi's vision, the land between rivers gave humanity one of its most enduring gifts, the rule of law. When people think of Hammurabi, they often picture the black stone stele inscribed with his famous laws. Yet behind those laws stood real lives, farmers planting barley, merchants sailing the Euphrates, craftsmen hammering bronze, priests chanting hymns, women negotiating marriage contracts, and slaves working in fields. To understand Babylon under Hammurabi, we must look not only at palaces and codes, but at the rhythm of everyday life in one of the world's first great urban civilizations. The social pyramid. Babylonian society was carefully structured, with clear distinctions between classes. At the top were the Awilu, or free citizens of high rank, landowners, officials, and priests. Below them were the Mushkenu, commoners who might own small plots of land or work as artisans. At the base were wards, enslaved individuals who could be prisoners of war, debt servants, or born into bondage. Hammurabi's code reflected these divisions. Punishments varied depending on the offender's class. If a noble injured another noble, the penalty was often an eye for an eye. But if a noble injured a commoner, the punishment was a fine. Justice was equal in principle, but unequal in practice. Yet society was not entirely rigid. Slaves could sometimes buy freedom. Commoners could rise through trade or military service. And the law provided certain protections even for the vulnerable, an innovation that distinguished Babylonian order from simple tyranny. Family and marriage. The family was the core of Babylonian life, and marriage was less about romance than about contracts. Parents arranged unions, recorded on clay tablets, specifying dowries, bride prices, and inheritance rights. Wives managed households, raised children, and often helped with farming or business. Yet women were not without power. They could own property, run businesses, and appear in court. Widows and priestesses, in particular, sometimes accumulated wealth. Hammurabi's laws protected wives against abandonment and neglect, though men retained the right to divorce more easily. Even so, compared to many later ancient societies, Babylonian women enjoyed notable legal recognition. Agriculture and economy. At its heart, Babylon remained an agricultural society. The fertile floodplains of the Euphrates produced barley, wheat, dates, and flax. Canals, carefully maintained by royal decree, irrigated the fields. Farmers paid taxes in grain or livestock, supporting the temples and state. Trade, however, made Babylon a crossroads of the ancient world. Caravans brought tin from Iran, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and cedar from Lebanon. Merchants floated boats of reeds and bitumen down the rivers, carrying wool, beer, and oil to distant markets. The city's wealth flowed from this exchange of goods and ideas. Babylon also developed a form of early banking. Families like the Ejabai, though prominent later, had predecessors in Hammurabi's time, houses that loaned silver, financed trade, and recorded contracts on clay tablets. Interest rates were steep, but credit allowed the economy to expand. Temples and religion. Religion permeated every aspect of daily life. The great temples of Marduk, Shamash, and Ishtar were not only spiritual centers, but also economic engines. Priests managed lands, employed laborers, and stored surplus grain. Festivals punctuated the year, blending civic pride with religious devotion. The most dramatic celebration was the New Year's festival, when Hammurabi himself would symbolically humble himself before Marduk, reaffirming that even the king ruled by divine mandate. For ordinary Babylonians, this ritual underscored a deep truth. Their lives, from planting to judgment, unfolded under the watch of gods who demanded order and justice. Work and craftsmanship. Beyond the fields, artisans filled Babylon's neighborhoods. Potters shaped vessels from river clay, stamped with decorative motifs. Weavers produced woolen textiles, prized across Mesopotamia. Metal workers forged tools, weapons, and jewelry from bronze. Hammurabi's code regulated their trades. A builder whose house collapsed could face death if it killed its owner. A doctor whose treatment failed could lose a hand. Harsh though these rules sound, they reveal the importance of accountability in a society where trust in professional skill was essential for survival. Everyday life in the city. Babylon itself bustled with activity. Streets crowded with donkeys and ox carts. Markets overflowed with grain, dates, and fish from the river. Children learned to write on clay tablets in scribal schools, mastering cuneiform signs that linked them to a 3,000-year tradition. Homes ranged from mud brick huts to multi-room townhouses with courtyards. Meals featured bread, dates, beer, and occasionally lamb or goat. Music filled the air. Lyres, drums, and flutes accompanied hymns and feasts. Storytellers recited myths of Gilgamesh and Inanna, keeping alive legends older than Babylon itself. Justice in action. Perhaps the most vivid glimpse of daily life comes from the legal records. Contracts survive detailing marriages, sales, loans, and disputes. One tablet might record a man lending silver to a merchant, with interest due after harvest. Another might preserve a wife's claim for support after her husband's disappearance. These texts reveal a society deeply concerned with fairness, stability, and the careful recording of obligations. A city alive. Under Hammurabi, Babylon was more than a capital. It was a living organism, pulsing with labor, worship, trade, and law. It was a place where the weak could appeal for justice, where farmers and merchants could prosper, and where the king's authority reached into the smallest details of daily life. Though Hammurabi's empire would not long survive him, the image of Babylon as a city of law and order endured. For its people, the steel of laws was not a symbol gathering dust. It was the framework of their lives, shaping everything from marriage to markets, from prayer to punishment. Empires often shine brightest just before the shadow of decline begins to stretch across them. So it was with Babylon after Hammurabi's death around 1750 BC. His 43 years of rule had forged unity, stability, and law. Yet those achievements were tied closely to his personal leadership. Without him, the fabric of the empire began to fray, and within a century Babylon had slipped from the commanding heights of Mesopotamian power. The fragile inheritance. Hammurabi's immediate successors inherited an empire that looked strong on the surface, but was fragile beneath. Its territory stretched wide, its bureaucracy dense, and its enemies restless. The laws were clear, but the authority to enforce them required constant vigilance. Hammurabi's son Samsu-Iluna lacked his father's charisma and military genius. Almost as soon as he ascended the throne, revolts erupted across the empire. Cities in southern Mesopotamia, including Uar and Isin, declared independence. These were places with deep cultural pride and long memories of autonomy. For them, Babylon's dominance was an experiment, not a tradition. When the strong hand of Hammurabi was gone, they seized their chance to reclaim old glory. Rebellions and invasions. Samsu-Iluna tried to put down the revolts, but his campaigns drained the treasury and stretched the army thin. At the same time, new waves of migrants pressed into Mesopotamia. Amorite groups, once allies and settlers under Hammurabi, now asserted independence. Elamite forces from the east eyed the weakened Babylonian state. The most dangerous challenge came from the south, where marshland communities, sometimes described as the Sealand dynasty, established their own kingdom. Operating from the swampy delta near the Persian Gulf, they resisted Babylonian control for generations. Their independence meant that Hammurabi's empire no longer stretched from sea to sea, as scribes once boasted. Economic strains. The decline was not only political but economic. Maintaining canals, feeding armies, and enforcing tribute required vast resources. With territories breaking away, revenues shrank. Agriculture faced challenges too. Centuries of irrigation had left some fields salted and less productive. Tablets from this period show rising grain prices and declining harvests, a recipe for unrest among farmers and city dwellers alike. Merchants, once protected by Hammurabi's strong administration, now faced danger on caravan routes. Trade with Anatolia, Syria, and Elam grew riskier. Without safe passage, wealth trickled rather than flowed into Babylon. The rise of rivals. As Babylon weakened, new powers began to rise. In the north, the Kassites, mountain people from the Zagros, began pressing into Mesopotamia. At first, they appeared as raiders and mercenaries, but their presence grew more permanent with each decade. In time, they would establish their own dynasty in Babylon, but during Samsu-Iluna's reign, they were a constant menace. To the west, the city of Mari had been destroyed earlier, but its cultural heirs in Syria and along the Euphrates reasserted influence. To the east, Elam flexed its strength once more. Mesopotamia was no longer a single empire. It was again a chessboard of rival states, each maneuvering for advantage. Babylon's shifting role. Despite decline, Babylon itself remained a powerful city. Its walls still stood, its temples still gleamed, and its scribes still wrote. The prestige of Hammurabi's legacy carried weight even as political control weakened. Kings continued to claim divine mandate, to present themselves as protectors of justice, and to oversee the rituals that bound people to their gods. But the empire Hammurabi had built, stretching across Mesopotamia, was gone. Babylon entered a new phase, sometimes dominant, sometimes overshadowed, always contested. Its survival owed not to unbroken power, but to resilience in the face of repeated setbacks. Memory of Hammurabi. Even in decline, Hammurabi's shadow loomed large. Later rulers invoked his name to bolster their authority. His code was copied, studied, and remembered. In many ways, Hammurabi's cultural legacy outlived his political empire. The Babylon that faltered after his death was not forgotten. It was reimagined, reshaped by each new dynasty that sought to claim its mantle. The turning tide. By the middle of the 17th century BC, the old Babylonian dynasty was fading. The Kassites pressed harder. The Sealand kingdom defied Babylon's authority, and regional powers in Assyria and Elam looked stronger by the year. The empire Hammurabi had forged in fire and law now flickered like a dying torch. Yet Babylon would not vanish. Like a river that twists and bends, but never dries, the city adapted. It passed from ruler to ruler, dynasty to dynasty, but always remained a cultural beacon. The fall of Hammurabi's empire was not the end of Babylon's story, only the close of one chapter in a saga that would stretch for another 1,000 years. For centuries, Babylon had been a city of dramatic rises and falls, empires forged by kings like Hammurabi, only to collapse under rebellion, famine, or invasion. Yet after this turbulence came an era of surprising longevity. Beginning around 1595 BC, the Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains, assumed power and ruled Babylon for nearly 400 years. Their dynasty became the longest in Mesopotamian history. Though less flamboyant than Hammurabi's reign, the Kassite era brought something Mesopotamia desperately needed: stability. The origins of the Kassites. The Kassites were outsiders, originally highland tribes, who had long served as mercenaries in Mesopotamian armies. At first, scribes described them with suspicion. People of the mountains, whose language and customs were unfamiliar. But unlike earlier invaders such as the Gudians, the Kassites did not destroy Babylonian traditions. Instead, they embraced them. When the Hittites raided Babylon around 1595 BC and toppled the old Babylonian dynasty, the Kassites stepped into the power vacuum. Rather than impose their own culture, they adopted Babylonian religion, administration, and even language. Over time, they became indistinguishable from the local elite, except for their dynastic name. A dynasty of longevity. The Kassite kings ruled Babylon from about 1595 to 1155 BC, a span unmatched by any other dynasty in Mesopotamian history. Their reign is sometimes called a quiet period, with fewer great conquests or legendary kings. But in this quietness lay strength. They reorganized land distribution by issuing Kaduru stones, boundary markers inscribed with grants of land given to nobles, soldiers, or temples. These stones often invoked divine curses on anyone who violated the agreement, blending legal authority with religious sanction. This system created a stable, loyal nobility that supported Kassite rule for generations. Babylon and the Club of Great Powers. During the Kassite era, Mesopotamia was no longer dominated by a single empire. Instead, a balance of rival kingdoms emerged. Egypt under the new kingdom pharaohs, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mitanni in northern Syria, and later the Assyrians to the north. Babylon under the Kassites became one of these great powers, part of a diplomatic club that managed rivalry through treaties, letters, and royal marriages. Evidence of this comes from the Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets found in Egypt. These diplomatic correspondences, written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the time, show Kassite kings addressing Egyptian pharaohs as brother. They exchanged gifts, horses, lapis lazuli, fine textiles, and sometimes complained. One Kassite king chided Pharaoh Amenhotep III for sending too little gold. "Gold in your land is as common as dust, yet you send me so little." It was international politics with a human touch, religion and cultural continuity. The Kassites preserved Babylonian religion while also introducing elements of their own. They continued the worship of Marduk, the city's patron god, ensuring Babylon's central place in Mesopotamian spirituality. At the same time, they elevated some Kassite deities, blending traditions into a shared pantheon. Astronomy, medicine, and scholarship flourished under their patronage. Astronomers refined systems for tracking celestial movements, laying groundwork for the zodiac. Medical texts reveal treatments that combined herbal remedies with ritual incantations. Far from being a dark age, the Kassite centuries saw significant intellectual achievements. Art and craftsmanship. Kassite art had its own flavor. Cylinder seals from this period display intricate geometric patterns and divine symbols. The Kaduru stones themselves became artistic as well as legal objects, decorated with carved emblems of gods, stars, and animals. Glassmaking advanced, producing colorful vessels for elite households. Though monumental architecture was less dramatic than earlier empires, craftsmanship remained highly developed. Everyday life in Kassite Babylon. For ordinary people, stability meant predictability. Farmers continued to cultivate barley and dates. Scribes recorded contracts on clay tablets, and merchants traded along revived routes. Taxes were collected, temples maintained, and cities thrived. The absence of constant conquest allowed resources to be invested in sustaining rather than rebuilding society. Babylon remained a cosmopolitan hub. Foreign merchants mingled in its markets, ambassadors from Egypt or Hutti passed through its gates, and priests conducted rituals that tied the city's fate to cosmic order. The Kassites may not have been native Babylonians, but they ensured that Babylon remained the beating heart of Mesopotamia, the beginning of pressure. Yet even this long era of stability had limits. By the 13th century BC, Assyria was rising as a militaristic power in the north. The Hittite Empire was aggressive in the west. Elam, to the east, remained a constant threat. And within Babylon, economic strains emerged as land became concentrated in the hands of elites. The final blow came in the 12th century BC, when the so-called Bronze Age collapse swept across the Near East. Climate change, famine, migrations, and invasions destabilized the entire region. Babylon, despite its resilience, could not escape. Elamite forces invaded around 1155 BC, plundering the city and carrying away treasures like the stele of Hammurabi. The Kassite dynasty, after nearly 4 centuries, fell. The legacy of the Kassites. Though less remembered than Hammurabi, the Kassites left an important legacy. Their long, relatively peaceful rule preserved Babylonian culture during a turbulent age. They maintained continuity in religion, language, and scholarship, ensuring that Mesopotamian traditions survived to influence future empires. Where earlier dynasties had burned brightly and collapsed quickly, the Kassites proved that longevity and adaptation could be just as powerful as conquest. They turned Babylon from a city of fragile empires into a city of enduring heritage, ready to rise again under future rulers. The Kassite dynasty had given Babylon centuries of stability, but history is never still. While Babylon prospered in the south, a restless power was growing in the north along the upper Tigris. The Assyrians, once traders and minor city-state rulers, were transforming into a military powerhouse. Their rise would create centuries of rivalry with Babylon, sometimes as uneasy partners, often as bitter enemies. Assyria's transformation. In earlier times, Assur was primarily a commercial hub, sending caravans of tin and textiles across Anatolia. But by the 14th and 13th centuries BC, Assyrian kings like Ashurbanipal I began shifting from trade to conquest. They built disciplined armies, mastered siege warfare, and expanded into surrounding regions. Unlike Babylon's Kassite rulers, who preferred diplomacy and continuity, Assyrian kings embraced aggression. They projected power through both military campaigns and fearsome propaganda. Inscriptions bragged of cities destroyed, rebels impaled, and lands turned to ash. The message was clear: resist Assyria, and you will suffer. Clash of North and South. Babylon and Assyria shared deep cultural ties. They spoke related dialects of Akkadian, worshipped many of the same gods, and drew on the same scribal traditions. Yet politically, they were rivals. Babylon, with its ancient prestige and religious primacy, considered itself the natural leader of Mesopotamia. Assyria, with its growing armies and ambition, demanded recognition as an equal. Tensions flared when Assyrian armies marched south. Around 1225 BC, Tukulti-Ninurta I launched a massive campaign, defeating Babylonian forces and capturing the city itself. He carried off the statue of Marduk, Babylon's supreme god, a shocking act that symbolized total humiliation. Babylon was not occupied for long, but the trauma lingered. Cycles of war and alliance. The centuries that followed saw Babylon and Assyria locked in a cycle of conflict and uneasy alliance. At times, Babylon sought Assyrian help against Elamite invasions. At other times, Babylon allied with Elam to resist Assyrian dominance. Assyrian kings recognized Babylon's cultural weight. Some even styled themselves as kings of both Assyria and Babylon, seeking legitimacy by claiming the southern throne. Yet Babylon's proud elites often resisted, preferring native rulers or alliances with distant powers rather than submission to their northern cousins. The role of Elam. The rivalry was further complicated by Elam, the kingdom east of the Tigris. From their capital at Susa, Elamite kings frequently intervened in Babylonian affairs, sometimes supporting rebels, sometimes raiding temples. In 1155 BC, Elamite forces had ended Kassite rule by plundering Babylon and seizing treasures like Hammurabi steel. This three-way tension, Babylon, Assyria, Elam, defined Mesopotamian politics for centuries. Babylonian resistance. Despite military setbacks, Babylon retained enormous prestige. Its priests guarded rituals that even Assyrian kings respected. The New Year's festival in Babylon remained a central ritual of Mesopotamian kingship, a ceremony no ruler could ignore. Even when Assyrian kings dominated militarily, they sought recognition in Babylon, knowing that divine legitimacy flowed from Marduk's temple. This gave Babylon leverage. While Assyria could burn cities and march armies, it could not erase Babylon's cultural authority. Babylon remained the spiritual heart of Mesopotamia, a beacon that warriors in the north had to reckon with. The human cost. For ordinary people, the Babylon-Assyria rivalry meant instability. Armies trampled fields, levied taxes, and deported populations. Farmers saw harvests seized. Merchants faced disrupted trade, and temples struggled to maintain offerings. Each invasion left scars, burned towns, stolen idols, broken families. Yet through it all, the Babylonians endured, clinging to their identity and traditions. The balance of power. By the 9th and 8th centuries BC, Assyria entered its full imperial phase, conquering lands from Egypt to Iran. Babylon, though often weaker militarily, still mattered. Sometimes it fell under Assyrian control, sometimes it rebelled, sometimes it played a dangerous game of diplomacy with Elam and other neighbors. The rivalry was not simply about land, it was about identity. Assyria was the hammer of Mesopotamia, feared and militarily dominant. Babylon was the soul, ancient, cultured, and divinely favored. Their struggle was less a single war than a centuries-long duel between force and tradition, a foreshadowing of the future. This tension would not end until the Neo-Babylonian revival many centuries later, when Babylon under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II would finally reclaim its full splendor. But during the Kassite decline and Assyria's rise, the rivalry established a pattern that shaped Mesopotamian history. Babylon as the eternal city of gods and culture, Assyria as the relentless empire of soldiers. Both would endure, both would fall, but together they defined the drama of the ancient Near East. By the 7th century BC, Assyria stood at the height of its power. From its northern heartland on the Tigris, the empire stretched across the Middle East, encompassing Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and much of Iran. Its kings commanded armies unmatched in discipline and brutality. Its wealth flowed from tribute and trade, and its cities gleamed with palaces and temples. But it was under Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, that this empire reached both its cultural peak and its fatal overextension. A king unlike the others, Ashurbanipal was not only a warrior but also a scholar. Unlike many rulers who prided themselves solely on conquest, he boasted of his literacy, claiming he could read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform, the languages of ancient Mesopotamian tradition. He surrounded himself with scribes and scholars, ordering the collection of texts from across his empire. The result was the Library of Nineveh, a treasure trove of over 30,000 clay tablets, preserving myths, omens, medical treatises, and the great epic of Gilgamesh. Ironically, it was through the ruins of his destroyed palace that modern archaeologists rediscovered Mesopotamian literature, an empire of iron and fear. But Ashurbanipal was no gentle scholar. His reign embodied the extremes of Assyrian power, intellectual brilliance paired with ruthless violence. His armies marched as far as Egypt, where they crushed Pharaoh Taharka's forces and briefly brought the Nile under Assyrian control. In Elam, east of Mesopotamia, He waged devastating campaigns, razing cities and salting the land. In his inscriptions, he bragged of leaving Elam so barren that wild asses roamed its ruined fields. The Assyrian army was a machine of terror. Iron weapons, siege engines, cavalry, and archers moved in coordinated fashion. Cities that resisted were besieged, their defenders slaughtered, survivors deported across the empire. Deportation served two purposes. It weakened rebellion at home and repopulate distant provinces with skilled laborers. Assyria's power was built not only on the sword but on the systematic movement of people. Babylon and the eternal rivalry. Babylon remained both a jewel and a thorn. Though often under Assyrian domination, it never truly accepted northern rule. Revolts erupted repeatedly, sometimes supported by Elam or other allies. Ashurbanipal at first tried conciliation, allowing his brother Shamash-Shumukin to rule Babylon as a vassal king. But fraternal trust crumbled. Shamash-Shumukin allied with Elam, Arameans, and Chaldeans in a great rebellion. The war was brutal. After a long siege, Babylon starved. Chronicles describe mothers eating their own children in desperation. When the city finally fell, Ashurbanipal unleashed vengeance, executions, deportations, and the destruction of allies. Yet, tellingly, the statue of Marduk was restored, and rituals resumed. Even in conquest, Assyrian kings recognized that Babylon's spiritual authority could never be fully destroyed. Splendor of the capitals. Assyrian power was embodied in its great cities, Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad. Palaces adorned with carved stone reliefs displayed endless scenes of conquest and royal hunts. These images were propaganda carved in alabaster. The king trampling enemies, lions struck down by arrows, tribute bearers kneeling in submission. Visitors could not fail to grasp the message. Assyria was invincible, and its king was favored by the gods. Nineveh under Ashurbanipal was a marvel. Its walls stretched for miles, enclosing temples, gardens, and aqueducts. The king's palace boasted colossal winged bulls guarding its gates, their faces human yet divine, symbolizing the fusion of strength, wisdom, and authority. This was the zenith of Assyrian architectural ambition, a city built to impress both mortals and gods. Cracks in the empire. Yet beneath the splendor, cracks widened. Constant campaigns drained resources. Deportations created simmering resentment in provinces. Heavy tribute burdened subject peoples. Assyria's reliance on fear worked as long as the army remained undefeated, but it offered no path to long-term loyalty. Even within the royal family, succession disputes loomed. Ashurbanipal's sons and heirs were less capable, and after his death around 627 BC, civil strife erupted. The empire that had seemed indestructible suddenly faltered. Babylon, ever resilient, seized its chance. Under a Chaldean dynasty led by Nabopolassar, Babylon allied with the Medes, rising from centuries of humiliation to strike back. A legacy of power and knowledge. Ashurbanipal's reign marked both the pinnacle and the beginning of the end. His empire stretched wider than any before in Mesopotamia. His library preserved the intellectual heart of 3 millennia. Yet his reliance on terror left few allies, willing to defend Assyria when rebellion spread. Within a generation of his death, Nineveh itself would fall, its palaces burned, its walls toppled. And yet, through the clay tablets buried in the ashes, his legacy endured. The words of Gilgamesh, the hymns to Ishtar, the astronomical records of Babylon, all survived because Ashurbanipal, the warrior scholar, believed that knowledge was as powerful as the sword. In that paradox lies the essence of Assyria, a civilization of brilliance and brutality, whose light shone fiercest just before it was extinguished. The Assyrian Empire had stood for centuries as the most feared power of the ancient world. Its kings carved empires with iron swords and ruled with terror. But by the late 7th century BC, the empire that once seemed invincible began to unravel. At the heart of this decline lay overextension, rebellion, and enemies who finally joined forces against the city of blood, Nineveh. The Gathering Storm. When Ashurbanipal died around 627 BC, he left behind not only palaces filled with treasures and libraries of wisdom, but also an empire stretched thin. His successors lacked his authority and vision. Civil wars broke out over succession, weakening the core of Assyrian strength. Provinces that had long endured deportations, heavy tribute, and ruthless punishment sensed opportunity. Babylon, long resentful of northern domination, became the center of revolt under the leadership of Nabopolassar, a Chaldean chieftain who seized the throne in 626 BC. At first, the Assyrians dismissed him as just another rebel. They had crushed countless Babylonian uprisings before. But Nabopolassar was different, patient, determined, and shrewd in seeking allies. To the east, the Medes, an Iranian people, had been growing in power in the Zagros Mountains. Their king, Cyaxares, had ambitions as great as Nabopolassar's. When the two joined forces, Assyria faced a coalition unlike anything it had seen before. Siege of Ashur. The first blow came in 614 BC, when the Median army swept down on Ashur, the ancient religious capital of Assyria. The city fell after brutal fighting. Its temples were desecrated, its population massacred. For centuries, Ashur had been the sacred heart of the empire. Its loss was both a military and spiritual wound. Nabopolassar soon joined his allies, and together Babylonians and Medes plotted the destruction of Nineveh itself. The fall of Nineveh. In 612 BC, the coalition marched on Assyria's glittering capital. Nineveh was the largest, richest city in the world at the time, defended by massive walls, river moats, and garrisons hardened by centuries of war. The Assyrians fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and isolated. Ancient chronicles and later traditions describe the siege lasting 3 months. The Medes and Babylonians breached the defenses with relentless assault. Some accounts suggest the Tigris River, swollen by flood, undermined parts of the city wall, allowing the attackers to pour through. What followed was not just conquest, it was annihilation. Nineveh burned. Palaces collapsed in fire. Colossal statues were toppled. Temples of the gods were looted. The wealth of centuries was carried away in carts. The library of Ashurbanipal, though buried in rubble, survived in fragments. But the city itself was reduced to ruins. The world reacts. The fall of Nineveh shocked the ancient world. For centuries, Assyria had been seen as unconquerable. Prophets in Judah exulted, calling it divine justice for a city of blood. Greek travelers later told stories of its sudden destruction, scarcely believing that such a mighty empire had vanished almost overnight. In truth, Assyria lingered a few more years. A remnant of the royal family fled west to Haran, clinging to a shadow kingdom. But when the Medes and Babylonians struck again in 609 BC, Haran too fell. The last Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal II, disappeared into obscurity. The empire was gone. Why Assyria fell? The collapse of Assyria was not due to one battle alone. Its very methods of rule sowed the seeds of destruction. By relying on fear, mass deportation, and heavy tribute, Assyria created hatred rather than loyalty. When weakness appeared, its subjects did not hesitate to rise. Overextension also played a role. An empire from Egypt to Iran was too vast to manage with ancient communication and logistics. Finally, timing sealed Assyria's fate. Its enemies united at the perfect moment, just as internal strife crippled Assyrian leadership. Without strong kings, the empire's machinery broke apart. The aftermath. In the power vacuum, Babylon rose once more, inaugurating the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, would soon make Babylon the wonder of the ancient world. Meanwhile, the Medes expanded across the Iranian plateau, laying groundwork for the Persian Empire to come. For Assyria, however, there was no revival. Its cities lay abandoned, its people scattered, its gods dethroned. Within a few generations, the very location of Nineveh was forgotten, buried under earth and myth until rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. Legacy of terror and brilliance. The Assyrians left behind no lasting empire, but they left a profound legacy. Their military innovations, iron weapons, cavalry, siege engines, became standard for later empires. Their administrative practices, from provincial governors to road networks, influenced successors like Persia. And ironically, the very library preserved under Nineveh's ruins allowed later ages to rediscover Mesopotamian literature. The fall of Nineveh thus marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Assyria, once the hammer of the ancient world, vanished in fire and flood. But its legacy lived on, in the words of Gilgamesh, in the strategies of empires to come, and in the cautionary tale of a kingdom built on fear rather than trust. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, the torch of Mesopotamian civilization passed southward. Babylon, long overshadowed by Assyria, now rose to become the jewel of the ancient world. Under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar II, 605 to 562 BC, the city reached a height of magnificence that secured its place in history, legend, and scripture. His reign embodied both ruthless conquest and breathtaking creation, leaving behind an image of Babylon as a city of wonder. A prince of war, Nebuchadnezzar had already proven himself before becoming king. As crown prince, he commanded Babylonian armies against the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, driving them from Syria and Palestine. This victory cemented Babylon's control over former Assyrian lands and elevated the young general's reputation. When his father, Nabopolassar, died later that year, Nebuchadnezzar inherited not just a throne but the chance to define an empire. He wasted no time. Campaigns in the Levant brought Jerusalem under Babylonian dominance. The first siege in 597 BC ended with the deportation of Judah's king and elite. A decade later, after renewed rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar returned. In 587 BC, Jerusalem was destroyed, its temple razed, and thousands were carried into exile. This event left an enduring mark in Jewish memory, the Babylonian captivity, and forever tied Nebuchadnezzar's name to sorrow in biblical tradition. Builder of wonders. But at home, Nebuchadnezzar was less a destroyer than a creator. Flush with tribute from conquests and profits from trade, he launched one of the most ambitious building programs in history. Babylon became not merely a capital, but a monument to imperial grandeur. The city sprawled over 850 hectares, with double walls encircling its districts. Ancient writers claimed the walls were so wide that 4-horse chariots could race along their tops. Processional avenues paved with limestone cut through the city, lined with glazed brick reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons, symbols of divine protection. At the city's heart stood the Asagila, the great temple of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. Beside it rose the Etemenanke Ziggurat, a 7-tiered tower, soaring nearly 300 feet, possibly inspiring the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. For worshippers, it represented a stairway between heaven and earth. For visitors, it was the architectural marvel of its age. The Hanging Gardens. Among Nebuchadnezzar's most enduring legacies is the legend of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Ancient Greek writers described them as terraced gardens, filled with exotic trees and flowers, irrigated by ingenious water-lifting devices. Supposedly, Nebuchadnezzar built them for his Median wife, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. Archaeologists debate whether the gardens truly existed in Babylon or perhaps in Nineveh. Yet the story itself testifies to the city's reputation for splendor. Whether fact or legend, the image of lush gardens rising above the desert plain captured imaginations for millennia, earning its place among the seven wonders of the ancient world. Rituals of power. Nebuchadnezzar understood that kingship in Mesopotamia meant more than conquest or construction. It meant divine sanction. Each year, during the Akitu New Year festival, the king humbled himself before the statue of Marduk. In a dramatic ritual, the high priest struck the king's face, forcing him to declare that he had ruled justly. If the god accepted him, tears were said to flow down the king's cheeks. Far from weakening his authority, this ritual affirmed that even the mighty Nebuchadnezzar ruled only by divine approval. A city of knowledge and trade. Beyond temples and palaces, Babylon thrived as a center of commerce and learning. Its markets bustled with goods from India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Merchants sold spices, gems, textiles, and grain. Banking houses offered loans and managed estates. Astronomers and scribes continued Mesopotamia's long tradition of scholarship, carefully recording celestial movements and refining mathematical systems that still influence how we measure time today. The city's wealth and cultural vibrancy made it a magnet for foreigners, traders, artisans, and exiles alike. For some, Babylon symbolized opportunity. For others, like the Israelites who mourned by its rivers, it was a place of loss. Either way, it left an indelible mark, a legacy in stone and scripture. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, he left behind not only a powerful empire, but also a city that had become synonymous with magnificence. Later kings would struggle to maintain his achievements, but the memory of Babylon's golden age endured. Greek historians marveled at its walls and temples. Biblical prophets condemned its pride but acknowledged its might. Artists and writers for centuries afterward evoked Babylon as the archetype of wealth, power, and excess. In Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the story of Mesopotamia reached one of its final and most dazzling chapters. It was a city where the ambitions of kings touched the heavens, where gardens defied the desert, and where the fate of nations was decided. A city whose ruins, though long buried, still whisper of its glory. After Nebuchadnezzar II's death, in 562 BC, Babylon seemed destined to remain the shining jewel of Mesopotamia. Its temples gleamed, its markets thrived, and its empire stretched across fertile plains. Yet within a single generation, cracks began to form. Leadership faltered, rivalries grew, and a new power was rising to the east, the Persians. The final years of Babylon were dominated by unusual kings, political missteps, and the dramatic arrival of Cyrus the Great. A fragile dynasty. Nebuchadnezzar's successors proved weak. His son Marduk, known in the Bible as Evil Merodach, ruled briefly before being overthrown. Other short-lived kings followed, until the throne passed to Nabonidus, a figure unlike any Babylonian ruler before him. Nabonidus was not of royal blood. He rose through the ranks as a court official and military officer. His claim to legitimacy came through marriage to a woman connected to the royal line. But what truly set him apart was his devotion, not to Marduk, Babylon's patron god, but to Sin, the moon god. This choice would prove fateful. The outsider king. Soon after taking the throne in 556 BC, Nabonidus shocked his people. He left Babylon for the distant oasis of Tema in Arabia, where he remained for nearly a decade. There he built temples to Sin, conducted religious reforms, and left the capital in the hands of his son Belshazzar, who acted as regent. Why did Nabonidus abandon Babylon? Scholars debate. Some suggest illness, others political unrest, others genuine religious zeal. Whatever the cause, the effect was disastrous. The priests of Marduk, guardians of Babylon's ancient traditions, felt betrayed. Nobles and merchants grew restless as the king neglected the great New Year festival, the sacred ritual that affirmed divine order and royal authority. Babylon, though still wealthy, lost confidence in its rulers. Belshazzar's rule. Belshazzar, though not officially king, held power in his father's absence. He commanded armies, oversaw tribute, and defended Babylon against external threats. But to the people, he remained only a substitute ruler. His name would be remembered less for administration than for one fateful night of revelry. Enter the Persians. While Babylon wavered, a storm gathered in the east. The Persians, once a minor people, had risen under Cyrus II, later called Cyrus the Great. Around 550 BC, Cyrus overthrew the Median Empire and quickly expanded across Anatolia and the Iranian plateau. By 539 BC, his armies turned toward Babylon. The empire that Nebuchadnezzar had once forged could not withstand this new threat. Babylon's subject peoples, weary of Assyrian brutality before and Babylonian dominance after, saw Cyrus as a liberator. His policy of tolerance, allowing conquered peoples to keep their gods and traditions, contrasted sharply with Nabonidus's religious experiments. The writing on the wall. The biblical book of Daniel tells a haunting story. Belshazzar, feasting with nobles in Babylon, used sacred vessels looted from Jerusalem's temple to toast his gods. Suddenly, a disembodied hand appeared, writing mysterious words on the palace wall. Mean, tekel parsin. Daniel, summoned to interpret, declared it a prophecy. Babylon's days were numbered, its king weighed and found wanting, its kingdom given to the Medes and Persians. Whether fact or legend, the story captured the sense of doom that hung over Babylon. That very night, according to tradition, Persian forces entered the city. The fall of Babylon. Ancient chronicles describe a clever maneuver. The Persians diverted the Euphrates River, lowering its waters enough to march soldiers through the riverbed beneath Babylon's walls. The city, famed for its fortifications, fell without major battle. Nabonidus was captured, Belshazzar slain, and Cyrus entered Babylon as a conqueror, but also as a restorer. Unlike the Assyrians who destroyed, Cyrus proclaimed himself chosen by Marduk to restore proper worship. He ordered temples repaired, religious festivals resumed, and exiled peoples allowed to return home, including the Jews, who would rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. A peaceful conquest, a lasting legacy. In 539 BC, Babylon's political independence ended, but its cultural prestige endured. Cyrus respected the city's traditions, even participating in its sacred rituals. The Persians incorporated Babylonian scholars into their administration, ensuring that Mesopotamia's legacy lived on. Yet for all its grandeur, Babylon's fall symbolized the end of Mesopotamia as an independent civilization. The city that once defined power and magnificence became a jewel in a foreign crown. Later generations would remember its wonders, its pride, and its sudden collapse. The story of Nabonidus and Belshazzar reminds us how quickly even the mightiest empire can fall, sometimes not with fire and sword, but with division from within and a single night of reckoning. The fall of Babylon in 539 BC marked a turning point not only for Mesopotamia, but for the ancient world as a whole. For 3 millennia, the land between the rivers had been ruled by its own dynasties, Sumerian priest-kings, Akkadian conquerors, Assyrian warlords, and Babylonian monarchs. Now, for the first time, Mesopotamia became part of a vast empire governed from beyond its borders. The architect of this transformation was Cyrus II of Persia, remembered to history as Cyrus the Great. The rise of a conqueror. Cyrus began as ruler of a small Persian kingdom in the rugged lands of the Iranian plateau. His people had once been vassals of the more powerful Medes. But around 550 BC, Cyrus rebelled, overthrowing the Median king and uniting the Medes and Persians under his leadership. This bold act set him on a course of conquest that would astonish the world. Within a decade, Cyrus defeated the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, taking its fabled treasures. He subdued the Greek cities of Ionia, extended his authority across Central Asia, and then set his sights on Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. Unlike conquerors who relied on brute force alone, Cyrus combined military skill with political genius. A different kind of rule. What made Cyrus remarkable was not only that he conquered, but how he ruled. Where the Assyrians had used terror and mass deportations, and where the Babylonians had demanded rigid religious loyalty, Cyrus chose a different path. His empire was built on tolerance and pragmatism. Conquered peoples could keep their gods, languages, and customs, so long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. This policy resonated deeply in Babylon. Nabonidus had alienated priests and elites by elevating the moon god Sin over Marduk. When Cyrus entered the city, he proclaimed himself chosen by Marduk to restore order. Far from resisting, many Babylonians welcomed him as a savior. The Cyrus cylinder. Evidence of Cyrus's vision survives in a remarkable artifact, the Cyrus cylinder, a clay inscription often called the world's first charter of human rights. In it, Cyrus describes how he entered Babylon peacefully, restored temples, and returned displaced peoples to their homelands. For the Jews exiled in Babylon, this policy was transformative. Biblical texts celebrate Cyrus as the anointed one of God, the ruler who allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Babylon under Persian rule. Although Babylon lost its independence, it retained prestige. Cyrus respected its traditions, attended its religious ceremonies, and maintained its temples. The city remained a cultural and administrative hub, while Persian satraps governed the wider region. Babylonian scribes, astronomers, and administrators were absorbed into the Persian bureaucracy, ensuring continuity of knowledge. In many ways, Persian rule brought stability. Trade routes expanded across an empire stretching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. A unified system of roads and standardized coinage encouraged commerce. Aramaic, already widely spoken, became the imperial language, connecting diverse peoples. For Mesopotamia, this meant integration into a political structure larger than any it had ever known. A new imperial model. Cyrus's achievement was more than conquest. It was the creation of a new model of empire. Rather than crushing diversity, he harnessed it. Rather than ruling through fear, he governed through respect and inclusion. This approach allowed the Persian Empire to endure for 2 centuries, far longer than Assyria's reign of terror. For Mesopotamians, this meant that their traditions did not vanish overnight. The gods of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon continued to be worshipped. Temples still hummed with rituals, and scribal schools still trained students in cuneiform. Yet gradually, the center of power shifted eastward. Babylon was no longer the master of empires, but a proud province within one. The legacy of Cyrus. When Cyrus died in battle around 530 BC, he left behind not only the largest empire the world had ever seen, but also a legacy of statesmanship. Even his enemies respected him. Greek historians portrayed him as the model ruler. Jewish texts remembered him as a liberator. Mesopotamian priests, weary of Nabonidus's eccentricities, honored him as Marduk's chosen. For Mesopotamia, Cyrus's conquest represented both an end and a beginning. The age of indigenous empires had passed, but the wisdom of the land between the rivers now flowed into a larger imperial current. Babylon would remain magnificent, but never again independent. The Persian transformation ensured that Mesopotamian achievements, from writing and astronomy to law and religion, would be preserved, adapted, and carried across continents. In this way, Cyrus the Great was not only a conqueror of Babylon, but also a guardian of its legacy. The conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC ended Mesopotamia's independence, but it did not erase its traditions overnight. For centuries afterward, The temples, scribes, and scholars of the land between the rivers continued to shape the ancient world. Yet under Persian, then Greek, rule, the unique culture of Mesopotamia gradually dimmed. What emerged was a twilight period, a long fading of a once radiant civilization. Under the Persians, the Achaemenid Persian kings respected Babylon. Cyrus and his successors participated in Babylonian ceremonies, restored temples, and employed local elites in their administration. The Akita festival, celebrating the new year, still took place, and the ziggurat of Etemenanke still towered over the city. Babylonian astronomers, working from temple observatories, refined centuries of celestial observations, creating mathematical models that influenced Persian and later Greek science. But there were signs of decline. Cuneiform remained the language of temples, yet Persian administrators increasingly used Aramaic, the empire's official script. Trade expanded under the Persian road system, but the wealth and political cloud of Babylon waned compared to new centers of power like Persepolis and Susa. The arrival of Alexander. A greater shift came in 331 BC. At the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander the Great defeated Darius III, the last Persian king. Soon after, Alexander entered Babylon. Ancient sources say the city greeted him with celebration. For a moment, Babylon seemed poised for revival. Alexander planned to make it the capital of his empire, and he ordered the restoration of temples and palaces. Yet fate intervened. In 323 BC, Alexander died suddenly in Nebuchadnezzar's palace at Babylon. His generals divided his empire, and Mesopotamia passed to Seleucus I, who founded the Seleucid dynasty. Instead of elevating Babylon, Seleucus built a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, designed as a Greek-style city with theaters, colonnades, and wide boulevards. Many Babylonians relocated there, drawn by economic opportunity. Babylon itself began to empty. A world of blending. The Seleucid period introduced Hellenistic culture into Mesopotamia. Greek became the language of administration, philosophy, and high culture. Temples still functioned, and cuneiform tablets were still inscribed, but now alongside Greek inscriptions. Gods were equated across cultures. Zeus with Marduk, Aphrodite with Ishtar. Festivals blended traditions, creating a hybrid religious landscape. Babylonian scholarship also adapted. Astronomers recorded their findings in both cuneiform and Greek. A priest named Berossus even wrote a history of Babylon in Greek, translating Mesopotamian myths and chronicles for a new audience. In doing so, he ensured that the stories of Gilgamesh, the flood, and the creation of the world reached beyond Mesopotamia's borders. Slow decline. By the 2nd century BC, cuneiform writing, once the foundation of civilization, was fading. Fewer scribes were trained, and fewer tablets were inscribed. The last known cuneiform astronomical tablet dates to AD 75. Gradually, the script that had carried Mesopotamian memory for 3 millennia slipped into silence. Cities that had stood since the dawn of history declined. Babylon shrank into a small town. Uruk, once the first true city of mankind, lingered for centuries, but with diminished grandeur. Temples still functioned, but their priests served shrinking congregations. By the time the Romans wrote of Mesopotamia, they spoke not of mighty cities, but of ruins. Continuity amid change. Yet the twilight was not complete darkness. Mesopotamian ideas lived on, though transformed. Jewish communities in Babylon, descendants of the exiles, thrived for centuries and eventually produced the Babylonian Talmud, one of the foundational texts of Judaism. Greek and later Roman scholars absorbed Mesopotamian astronomy, shaping the study of the stars for generations. Agricultural practices, irrigation systems, and folk traditions rooted in Sumer and Akkad survived in everyday life. A civilization fades, a legacy remains. By the time of the Parthians and later the Sasanians, Babylon was little more than a memory. Travelers marveled at its ruins, but found little of its former glory. The twilight of Mesopotamian culture was complete. Yet this fading was not failure. Like a river flowing into the sea, Mesopotamia's traditions merged into the wider currents of world civilization. The twilight period was a bridge, from the ziggurats of Sumer to the libraries of Greece, from cuneiform tablets to Jewish scriptures, from the astronomers of Babylon to the mathematicians of Alexandria. In this long dusk, Mesopotamia ensured its light would never be fully extinguished. When the last embers of Mesopotamian independence faded, it might have seemed that the civilization of the land between two rivers had finally ended. The cities crumbled, the temples emptied, and the cuneiform script disappeared. Yet Mesopotamia never truly died. Its achievements flowed outward like water, shaping the course of human civilization long after its political power was gone. Writing and the memory of the world. Perhaps Mesopotamia's greatest gift was writing. What began as clay tokens for counting sheep and grain evolved into cuneiform, the first system capable of recording law, poetry, contracts, and history. Even when the script itself was forgotten, the very idea of recording human thought on a durable medium lived on. Today, every book, email, and contract owes something to the scribes of Uruk. Law and justice. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the earliest surviving law codes. Its principles, that laws should be written, that justice should be consistent, that the vulnerable deserve protection, still echo in modern legal systems. Though punishments in ancient Babylon may seem harsh, the underlying idea that society must be governed by shared rules, not a ruler's whims, was revolutionary. Science and numbers. Every time we glance at a clock or measure an angle, we echo Mesopotamian mathematics. The 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, and the division of the year into 12 months all come from Babylonian calculations. Their astronomers tracked the movements of planets with astonishing precision, laying the groundwork for later Greek and Islamic astronomy. Even the zodiac, with its 12 signs, began as a Babylonian tool for understanding the heavens. Religion and myth. The myths of Mesopotamia continue to ripple through world culture. The flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh resembles the tale of Noah. The struggle between order and chaos, between gods and monsters, informed later religious traditions across the Near East. Ritual practices, priestly hierarchies, and the concept of divine kingship influenced Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and beyond. Urban life and the idea of the city. The first cities, Uruk, Lagash, were Mesopotamian. Here, humanity learned how to live together in dense communities, to share resources, and to face the challenges of sanitation, governance, and conflict. Every modern metropolis, from New York to Tokyo, carries faint echoes of those first attempts to build a world larger than a village. The flow of knowledge. Even after their decline, Mesopotamian ideas did not vanish. They passed into Persian administration, into Greek philosophy, into Roman law, and later into Islamic scholarship. Through translations, trade, and memory, fragments of Mesopotamian wisdom reached medieval Europe and eventually the modern world. Rediscovery in modern times. For centuries, Mesopotamia was little more than a name in the Bible or classical texts. But in the 19th century, archaeologists began to dig at places like Nineveh, Ur, and Babylon. They uncovered palaces, ziggurats, and hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets. Slowly, scholars cracked the code of cuneiform. Suddenly, voices that had been silent for 2,000 years spoke again. The kings of Sumer, the scribes of Akkad, the poets of Babylon, all came back to life. Why it matters today. The story of Mesopotamia is more than ancient history. It is a mirror of ourselves. We, too, wrestle with questions of justice, power, belief, and survival. We, too, build cities, make laws, and gaze at the stars, wondering what they mean. The Mesopotamians remind us that civilization is a fragile but powerful experiment, an attempt to make human life larger than any single person's existence. A civilization without end. Though the rivers changed their course and the empires fell, the legacy of Mesopotamia endures in our words, our laws, our science, and our myths. The people who once built ziggurats in the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates live on, not in bloodlines or borders, but in ideas. Their story is our story. Their struggles are struggles. Their hopes are hopes. The land between two rivers may no longer dominate the map, but it still flows through the veins of history. And as long as humanity remembers, Mesopotamia will never truly fade.